Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, I was once a slave of Christ. I came to understand the words in the New Testament when a bondservant of Jesus Christ, a slave of the Lord. And in fact, I talked to some Muslims, for example, right? And they say that they're servants of Allah, slaves of God. They use similar language. The biblical account, though, overall, especially looking in the Old Testament, we've talked about this before, but I want to ask, slavery, can we talk about its ugliness for a moment and why atheists bring this up to Christians all the time? Our good friend Jay Caballero, for example, he's like, no, I see it. It's ugly. It's real. I'm not going to downplay it like Christian apologists do, where they say, no such thing. The Bible does not condone it. That's not the case. Yeah. So we had an experience in America that still haunts us today about the Antebellum South slavery. There's still, it's still stuff that haunts us. So can you compare biblical slavery to something like the South? And was it that ugly or potentially that ugly in the ancient world?
So I wrote a book on this a while back, I guess about a year ago. Did the Old Testament endorse slavery? And this book was mainly focused on comparing the Hebrew Bible to the ancient Near East and the way that slavery is practiced and how it was presented in the law collections, in both the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East. In the new book, I have a chapter on slavery because it's a handbook on the Old Testament. I thought it was a good idea to have something in there about slavery just because it comes up so often, but I didn't want it to be just repeating what was in the book in shorter form. So I moved into the New Testament, the early church, and the Antebellum South. Now, I have no expertise, formal training in slavery in the Antebellum South. So I rely pretty heavily on Thomas Morris's book, Southern Slavery and the Law. It's a book that I actually highly recommend for anybody that's interested in looking at what slavery was like, what the slave laws were like in the Antebellum South, as early as, following the Revolution, colonial periods, or the colonial periods, and then following the Revolution, and then coming into just before the Civil War. So Thomas Morris, his goal is not to make that comparison. He's just talking about what slave laws were like. But the thing that always stood out to me in these slavery conversations is the first thing that a Christian apologist will say is, well, let's just get it off the table. It wasn't like slavery in the Antebellum South. So you can just get rid of that idea. They're not the same. You hear that, I think, in every video that I see, every debate that I've ever had. It's like the first thing that comes out. And, at first my response was, who cares? That's not the point. The point isn't, is it exactly like slavery in the Antebellum South, which was unbelievably horrific, right? Any more than if we've got somebody on trial as a serial killer, and he's gone around and he's shot 10 people with a .45, killing them instantly. The defense attorney hopefully doesn't stand up and the first thing he says is, well, let's just get this off. He's no Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Well, okay. So he didn't murder them as a serial killer in far more grotesque ways, But so what? I mean, that doesn't, he's still a serial killer, right? So if we're trying to understand what slavery was like, that's a weird thing. That's a weird way to start out. But again, it's to sort of muddy the waters, right? Poison the well in a sense. However, I started thinking, well, how similar were they? And one of the things that I find is that Christian apologists will often make the comparison between slavery as it was practiced, in the sense of how it actually played out on the ground in the Antebellum South, and the laws in the Hebrew Bible. So comparing those two things, which is an unfair comparison, I think. If you're going to do a comparison, you either have to, let me give an example. If you go to something like Jeremiah 34 or Nehemiah 5, and you talk about, well, this is what the Israelites did with slaves. They kept their slaves, and then longer than they were supposed to, and then recaptured them after they set them free when it became convenient for them. The Christian apologist will very quickly say, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't judge the Bible and judge God's character based on what people did. You have to do it based on the laws that he gives. Well, I think the same holds true in reverse. You can't go to what people did, breaking the law in the Antebellum South, and then compare that to the laws in the Hebrew Bible. So Thomas Morris goes to great lengths to try to show what the laws were like in the Antebellum South. And what's interesting about it is the laws themselves and the rationale, the legal rationale that brought about these rulings is very similar to the legal rationale that you see in the Hebrew Bible. I think a good example of this is, if you talk about Exodus 21, 20 to 21, where it says if a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod and they die immediately, then the master is to be punished, which probably means killed, right? However, if the slave survives a day or two, then he's not to be punished because he's his property. What's going on in those verses is probably, I think most scholars would say that the rationale here is that, well, you have to be able to beat your slave. Right? If you read what people like Michael Fox or Bruce Waltke or any of these people that write on the book of Proverbs, you go to Proverbs 29, it's like, yeah, you have to be able to beat your slave. It's anticipated that you're gonna, it's encouraged that you do corporal punishment on your slave, because how else do you motivate them? That's the rationale. They're there either for 6 years, or they're as chattel slaves, they're there forever. So that there is no like early release, that you can't like work really hard and get out of early. So what do? How do you motivate them? And it's the same thing, with like, if somebody's working for 8 hours, as opposed to, they have to stack 50 boxes and then they can go home. Their motivation for going home is they get those 50 boxes stacked faster, so they work harder, they move faster. Well, if they have to be there for 8 hours anyway, they're going to stack those 50 boxes as slow as they can, right? This is a run out the clock situation, as Stanley would say in The Office. And so the idea here is that, well, masters have to be able to beat their slaves, but they can't abuse their slaves, and they can't murder their slaves. Makes sense, right? And I think that's that's the balance that the text is trying to strike. Now, they should just say you shouldn't own people, but with what they're doing, that's their rationale. And Christian apologists will be very quick to say, see, look at what they're doing. I mean, they're trying to protect the humanity of the slave.
Yeah, you can't kill them.
Yeah, you can't kill them. You can't abuse them.
Yeah, right.
You can't abuse them.
But you can beat them, though.
But you can beat them.
But abuse must be interpreted to mean like taking an eye out, or like permanent damage.
That's right.
It seems.
Think about it with your kids, right? In the Old Testament.
You spank them in the Old Testament.
That's not considered abuse. You beat them with wooden rods. That's not considered abuse in the Old Testament. What's considered abuse is if you were to beat them for more than moderate correction, right? That's sort of the idea. So the same is true with a slave. horrible, right, from our modern vantage point, and we should see it as horrible from our modern perspective.
Shouldn't we clarify and say that probably the slave's getting a far worse beating than just a child? Wouldn't you think?
I mean, as far as the law is concerned, I think they probably see them as equal. But you're absolutely right. There is definitely a distinction shown between, in that particular proverb, actually in Proverbs 29:21, it says, a slave who is pampered from youth turns out to be a son. Right? In other words, it like turns out to be spoiled, insolent, that sort of thing. So, right, there's definitely a distinction to be made. But that rationale is what's key, I think, here, and that is that masters have to be able to perform corporal punishment on their slaves in their minds, but they can't abuse them. So how do we balance this? Well, you set up a law like Exodus 21:20-21. If you beat them and they die, it's evidence that you were doing more than moderate correction. And if you knock out the eye of a tooth, or eye of a tooth, if you knock out the eye of a slave or the tooth of a slave, then they're set free for the sake of that, because that's a serious thing. Okay, what do we see in the laws in the Antebellum South? Well, if you read through what the judges are wrestling with, they're wrestling with exactly the same problem. How is it that a master can motivate his slave to do what he wants him to do via corporal punishments? What they're going to do, you got to be able to give them moderate correction. But we want to protect the humanity of the slave. Surprisingly, it was surprising to me and surprising to other people, that the laws, particularly leading up to the Civil War, after the Revolution, like these judges are saying, no good Christian master will abuse his slave, and certainly no good Christian will murder his slave.
But slave is ultimately on the table. Like, there's no taking it off the table. The Bible is for it.
Yes, no question.
Right.
No question.
So they have the Bible supporting them,
yes.
Whereas the guys who are saying no to the whole thing, they're the liberals.
Yeah, definitely. There's no question. But the fact that the judges are coming to the same sort of conclusion, the same sort of balance in their minds that you see in the Hebrew Bible, what they say is, well, obviously, you're allowed to moderately correct your slave by beating them. However, if you abuse them, if you do more than moderate correction, or you murder them, then the law says, these judges are saying, it's going to be the same punishment as if you killed a free white person. Now that's significant, because the law is trying to do something that's very similar, if not the same, as what the law in the Hebrew Bible is trying to do.
Do you mean to tell me that slavery in the Antebellum South wasn't that bad? Because it's clear, using the rationale of apologists, that they would be killed for killing these slaves. They would be punished for doing such a thing to these slaves. Slavery wasn't that bad 300 years ago, Dr. Josh.
See, and this is what scares me. This is what scares me. Because, we hear, if we don't remember the past, we're doomed to repeat it, right? That's the old adage. And it scares me when I hear apologists saying, well, slavery in the Hebrew Bible wasn't so bad. Because look, yeah, they could beat them. Yeah, okay, they could beat them. But they couldn't abuse them. And they couldn't murder them.
So it's just like a regular employee.
Yeah,
right.
And think about it. I mean, these slaves, they were probably really, really poor. And so this is better for them. When you start to have these types of justifications for owning another person as property, I get real nervous, because it's the same sort of rationale in many respects that we see in the Antebellum South.
Even modern days, I'll say this just as we go, there are some white supremacist groups that say the same thing, justifying what happened.
Yeah.
There's no justification for, I mean, it's ugly. It is what it is. It happened.
Yeah.
But let's not justify it. Let's call it what it is.
Yes, and I want to be clear. I'm in no way suggesting that Christian apologists, when they say slavery in the Hebrew Bible wasn't so bad, that they're knowingly like trying to justify slavery in the Antebellum South. But let's be clear, they're not trying to do that.
I'm being silly with that connection. Is my point.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's important to point out that the logical conclusion, if we go down that road, can lead people to justify that sort of behavior. Because you come up with rationalizations. Why is it, how else are you going to motivate the slave, right? If you start making asking those types of questions, these are the types of answers that they came to 2,500 years ago, and it's the same kind of rationalizations and answers that they came to 300 years ago. So I guess my point is that what we see in the legal collections, there are many places that there's continuity between them. And what's dangerous about that is that we see what happened in the Antebellum South. Even though the law was intended to protect the slave, it created unintentionally these huge loopholes for masters to abuse their slaves. Because how do you, so the master says, okay, I can't abuse or murder my slave. But if he dies under moderate correction, and that's what Exodus 21, 20 to 21 is doing. If he dies under moderate correction, right, then the slave master isn't held liable because, well, he's moderately correcting him, which he has to be able to do. And if he dies after a couple of days as a result of that, well, the benefit of the doubt is given to the master. He was just moderately correcting them and something else intervened. Right? So if the slave dies in the Antebellum South under moderate correction, well, the slave owner's not held liable. Right? He has to be able to moderately correct him. Well, how do you prove abuse? Well, I mean, you got to have somebody come and testify that he was abusing him, or the master has to volunteer and, all right, I was abusing him, punish me, right? So how often is that going to happen? How often is another slave owner going to come and say, yep, that guy was abusing his slave, that guy murdered his slave, right? Not that often, and that's what we see on the ground. It didn't happen all that often. So we have these egregious stories about slaves being locked up, neck chains and arm chains and left out in outhouses to freeze to death. And well, moderate correction, right? Horrific stuff. And that's what I think we all need to be very cautious about in these discussions, is to say, let's not whitewash the past. Let's not try to make it seem better than it was, because once we get in that mindset, it's just all too easy to go back down these paths that we've gone down in the past. And we've seen the horrific results. We never want to go back to a time when we're owning people as property. And that's why the United Nations has this, they go, no slavery, you can't do slavery. You can't sell yourself and have that contract enforced, right? Because we know where that leads. And we don't want to go back down that path.
I agree 100%. I just would like to say they're doing it to defend God and the Bible. And that's why they're doing it. And they're not even realizing how groups that are obviously racist today, that share that ideology, would love for things to go back to the way they were 300 years ago type of idea. They're also defending the Bible and God in their angle. So what we're saying is I think some liberal thinking needs to take place in the way that you approach these books and understand what really happened, or remain cognitive, like having cognitive dissonance, because but going out there acting like, oh, the Bible never, like, that's a lie at that point. You're being ignorant on the topic. And so this is powerful. Thank you.
Of course.